There are moments in history when the past refuses to stay buried, when a voice from another century seems to speak directly into the present, not with certainty, but with an unsettling familiarity. Now, consider this. A man who lived quietly in the early 20th century, who never held political office, never sought fame, and never claimed prophetic authority, yet left behind thousands of recorded statements that continue to echo decades after his death. What if some of those words were never meant for his own time at all? Edgar Cayce was, by most outward measures, an ordinary man. Born in rural Kentucky in 1877, he lived a modest life shaped by faith, discipline, and routine. He worked as a photographer. He taught Sunday school. He avoided spectacle. And yet, beneath this unremarkable surface existed something that even his closest contemporaries struggled to explain. When Cayce lay down, closed his eyes, and entered a self-induced sleep-like state, his voice changed, his cadence slowed, his language became precise, technical, and often far beyond his own education. It was in this condition that he delivered what would later be called readings. These were not casual predictions or poetic riddles. They were structured responses to questions posed by others about health, history, future events, even the fate of nations. Over 4 decades, from 1901 until shortly before his death in 1945, Cayce produced more than 14,000 such readings. Every word was transcribed by stenographers, every session dated, cataloged, and preserved. Long after his passing, these documents would be studied not as folklore, but as records. Does this sound familiar? The pattern of dismissing something as fringe at first, only to revisit it later with uneasy curiosity? What set Cayce apart from other so-called prophets of his era was not theatrical flair, but consistency. He never claimed personal authorship of the information he delivered. He insisted he was simply accessing knowledge that already existed, somewhere beyond conscious awareness. Skeptics questioned him. Researchers tested him, and over time, an uncomfortable list of correlations began to form. He spoke of global conflict years before the outbreak of world wars. He warned of a major financial collapse long before 1929. He described medical treatments that would not exist until decades later, some of which were eventually validated by modern science. None of this made him rich. None of it made him powerful. In fact, Cayce often tried to limit public attention, uncomfortable with the role others projected on him. And yet the archive grew, quietly, methodically, waiting. Now consider the significance of that archive itself. These readings were not scattered notes or second-hand recollections. They were centralized, preserved, and later housed by an organization dedicated to studying consciousness, history, and human potential. For decades, scientists, doctors, and historians sifted through them, not to prove belief, but to identify patterns. That distinction matters, because patterns, unlike predictions, do not demand faith. They demand comparison. And comparison is where the story begins to shift. Among Cayce's thousands of readings, there is a recurring theme he referred to as the Great Change. He did not describe it as a single event, nor did he assign it a neat date. Instead, he spoke of a process, one that unfolded slowly, then suddenly. A time when societies would reach a breaking point, not only economically or politically, but morally and spiritually. A time when institutions people trusted would begin to fracture under their own weight. At first glance, this sounds vague, almost generic. Civilizations have risen and fallen throughout history. Every era believes it stands at the edge of transformation. But Cayce's descriptions grow more specific the closer they move toward the mid-20th century and beyond.
He spoke of a nation that would face its greatest trial not from external enemies, but from internal division. A nation forced to confront the consequences of its own excesses. What if those words were never about his own lifetime? Cayce died in January of 1945, months before the end of the Second World War. He never saw the Cold War. He never saw the internet. He never saw modern media, globalized finance, or the scale of influence that single individuals could wield in the 21st century. And yet, again and again, his readings circle around themes that feel uncomfortably modern: polarization, loss of trust, the erosion of shared truth. Does this sound familiar? Here is where the narrative becomes more delicate and more compelling. Cayce rarely spoke in names. He spoke in symbols, in archetypes, in cycles that repeated themselves across time. He believed history did not move in straight lines, but in spirals, returning to similar challenges under new conditions. According to this view, individuals mattered less than the roles they played. Leaders were not isolated figures, but expressions of deeper social forces. In this framework, a prophecy is not a script, it is a mirror. Cayce often emphasized that the future was not fixed. His readings described possibilities, not certainties. Outcomes depended on choices, collective and individual. And yet he warned that when certain patterns aligned, economic imbalance, moral decay, environmental neglect, the window for change narrowed rapidly. At that point, events no longer felt chosen, they felt inevitable. What if that narrowing window is what we are sensing now? Before any mention of modern politics, before any connection to contemporary figures, Cayce's credibility is established through this quiet accumulation of detail, the sheer volume of his work, the discipline of its documentation, the number of instances where abstract warnings later appeared concrete. This foundation is crucial because what follows is presented not as belief, but as pattern recognition. Now consider how rarely history announces its turning points in advance. Most are only obvious in hindsight. People living through them often feel confusion before clarity, tension before collapse, anticipation before understanding. Cayce suggested that one of the defining features of a great change was precisely this feeling, the sense that something fundamental is shifting, even if no single headline explains why. If that feeling sounds familiar, it may be because it's becoming harder to ignore. By the end of his life, Cayce spoke less about specific events and more about consequences. He warned that societies obsessed with power, image, and material success would eventually be forced to reckon with what they had neglected, not through divine punishment, but through exposure. Structures built on unstable foundations would reveal their weakness under pressure. And pressure, he implied, was inevitable. As we move forward in this story, remember this foundation. Remember that Cayce was not positioned as a prophet shouting warnings from the margins, but as a quiet observer whose words were preserved long enough to be re-examined. The question is no longer whether he believed what he said. The question is why his language feels increasingly aligned with the world we now inhabit. What if the past has been describing the present all along?
Prophetic documentary thriller. There is a subtle shift that happens before any great transformation. It does not arrive with sirens or declarations. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, as a change in tone. Conversations feel heavier. Certainties feel thinner. People sense that the rules they once trusted no longer apply in the same way. Now consider how often in recent years that sensation has surfaced across news cycles, private thoughts, even ordinary moments of hesitation. In Edgar Cayce's language, this was the early stage of what he called the Great Change.
not an explosion, but a pressure buildup, a slow accumulation of unresolved tension within a society that outwardly appeared powerful, yet inwardly was losing cohesion. He described it as a period when systems would continue to function, but belief in those systems would quietly erode, when confidence vanished long before collapse became visible. Does this sound familiar? Cayce spoke of a nation facing a crisis not because it lacked resources, but because it no longer agreed on meaning. He warned that prosperity could mask fragility, and that division did not require violence to be destructive. It only required distrust. According to his readings, the most dangerous fractures were not physical borders, but psychological ones. The point at which citizens no longer shared a common narrative about who they were or where they were going. This, he suggested, was the true beginning of the Great Change. What makes his descriptions unsettling is their emotional accuracy. He did not paint a picture of sudden chaos. Instead, he described a society caught in contradiction, a place where technological advancement accelerated while moral clarity declined, where information multiplied but understanding diminished, where people felt simultaneously connected and isolated. The paradox was the warning. He referred to this as a form of national karma, not in a mystical sense of punishment, but as consequence. Choices made over decades, economic, environmental, cultural, creating conditions that could no longer be ignored. In this view, karma was simply momentum, and momentum, once established, was difficult to reverse. Now consider the timing. Cayce repeatedly indicated that this period of reckoning would emerge long after his lifetime. He spoke of the later years and the time of testing, aligning the peak of this change with what we would now call the mid-2020s. He did not frame it as coincidence, he framed it as convergence, multiple unresolved cycles arriving at the same moment. Economic imbalance, political polarization, environmental stress, spiritual exhaustion. Separately, each could be managed. Together, they formed something else entirely. He warned that during this phase, people would feel compelled to choose sides, not always based on reason, but on fear. Institutions would become symbols rather than safeguards. Language itself would harden, losing nuance. The goal would shift from understanding to winning, and in that shift, something essential would be lost. What if the Great Change is less about what happens to a country and more about what happens within its people? Cayce believed that societies, like individuals, avoided self-reflection until discomfort forced it. He suggested that the United States, in particular, had long postponed this reckoning by leaning on growth, expansion, and image. Success became a shield, but shields, he warned, eventually crack. One of his more striking observations was that the Great Change would feel confusing rather than catastrophic at first. There would be constant motion, constant noise, yet no clear resolution. Headlines would contradict one another, experts would disagree, trust would fragment, and in that environment, certainty would become a commodity, something people sought desperately, even if it came packaged as illusion. Does this sound familiar? He noted that during such periods, leadership figures often rose not because they offered solutions, but because they offered clarity, simple explanations for complex problems. These figures did not create the division, they reflected it. They acted as mirrors, amplifying what already existed beneath the surface. In this sense, leaders were symptoms, not causes. Cayce's readings suggest that the Great Change could not be understood through a single event. It was a mood, a climate, a slow bending of reality away from what people expected. And as expectations failed, frustration grew. That frustration, left unresolved, sought an outlet. This is where the idea of inevitability begins to appear, not because the future is fixed, but because momentum has weight. Cayce warned that once a society reached a certain level of polarization, attempts at moderation would be interpreted as weakness. Compromise would feel like betrayal. Dialogue would feel pointless. At that stage, the path forward narrowed dramatically. He did not claim this outcome was inevitable, but he did suggest it was likely unless a profound shift in awareness occurred. And awareness, he emphasized, rarely emerges voluntarily. It emerges under pressure. As the Great Change intensified, Cayce foresaw a period when people would begin questioning everything they had once accepted without hesitation. Authority, media, institutions, even the idea of truth itself. This was not, in his view, a sign of enlightenment, but of disorientation. When nothing feels reliable, people cling to whatever feels solid, even if it's flawed. What if that clinging is already happening? Cayce's language becomes more cautionary here. He warned that confusion creates vulnerability, and vulnerability invites extremes. In such conditions, societies often gravitate towards archetypes, simple roles that promise order amid chaos. The strong leader, the builder, the restorer, the one who claims to stand above the mess and impose direction. This is not where the story names names. It doesn't need to. The pattern itself is the message. The Great Change, as Cayce described it, was not an ending. It was a test, a moment when a nation would be forced to confront the gap between its ideals and its actions. Whether it bridged that gap or widened it would determine what came next. And according to his timeline, that test does not stretch endlessly into the future. It converges.
Prophetic documentary thriller. Patterns rarely announce themselves outright. They reveal their presence slowly, through repetition, through symbols that resurface across time in slightly altered forms. Edgar Cayce believed this was how history truly moved, not as a straight line, but as a series of recurring archetypes, each emerging when conditions allowed. Now consider one of the most persistent figures in his readings, the builder. Cayce never described this figure with a proper name. He didn't need to. Instead, he outlined a role, a type of leader who appears during periods of instability, promising restoration through construction, order through dominance, and greatness through visible achievement. This archetype was defined not by ideology, but by imagery: towers, foundations, monuments, gold. Symbols of permanence meant to project strength in uncertain times. Does this sound familiar? According to Cayce, the builder emerges when a society feels unmoored, when people crave something solid to point to, something tangible that reassures them progress is being made. In such moments, abstract values feel insufficient. What resonates instead are visible markers of success, structures that rise above the skyline, wealth that gleams, language that emphasizes winning, dominance, and scale. The builder does not present himself as a philosopher or a healer. He presents himself as a fixer, someone who can take what feels broken and remake it through force of will. He speaks in absolutes. He simplifies complexity. And most importantly, he frames the past as something that was stolen and the future as something that can be reclaimed. Cayce warned that this archetype was neither inherently evil nor inherently virtuous. It was reactive, a mirror of collective desire. When fear dominated, the builder amplified fear. When pride dominated, the builder amplified pride. In this sense, the figure was less an origin point and more a convergence point, a focal expression of deeper currents already in motion.
What makes Cayce's description unsettling is the detail with which he ties this archetype to cycles of rise, rejection, and return. He spoke of leaders who ascended rapidly, fell dramatically, and then re-emerged at moments of even greater tension, not because circumstances had improved, but because unresolved conflict had intensified. In his framework, a return was never a reset, it was an escalation. The second act carried higher stakes because the lessons of the first had gone unlearned. Now consider how societies interpret such returns. Supporters see redemption, proof of resilience, a second chance to finish what was started. Critics see warning signs, evidence that the underlying problem was never addressed. Both reactions, Cayce suggested, were symptoms of the same fracture. The builder's imagery plays a crucial role here. Towers are not just buildings, they are statements. They declare ambition, permanence, a refusal to bend. But Cayce often used these images symbolically, suggesting that structures built to demonstrate strength could also become liabilities if their foundations were unstable. Height, in this sense, magnified risk. He spoke of gold not merely as wealth, but as distraction, a surface shine that diverted attention from deeper imbalances. Gold represented success measured externally, while decay progressed internally. The greater the emphasis on display, the less attention paid to substance. What if the obsession with building is actually a response to fear of collapse? Cayce's readings imply that the builder archetype thrives in polarized environments. Division sharpens contrasts. It creates an us versus them mentality that the builder can navigate effectively. Promises become sharper, language becomes bolder, nuance fades, complexity is reframed as weakness. In such conditions, the builder is not evaluated on outcomes, but on intent, on confidence, on spectacle. Supporters do not demand consistency, they demand conviction, and conviction, performed convincingly enough, can substitute for coherence, at least temporarily. This is where Cayce's warnings intensify. He suggested that the return of the builder marks a narrowing of options, a point at which moderation has lost its appeal. When compromise no longer satisfies either side, extremes gain traction. The builder does not create this environment, but he flourishes within it, and his success signals that the underlying tensions have reached a critical threshold. Cayce described this phase as deceptive. Outwardly, it appears as renewed strength, a comeback, a reclamation of lost ground. But inwardly, pressure continues to build. The same forces that caused the initial fall remain unresolved, now compounded by higher expectations and deeper division. What if a return is not a sign of healing, but a sign that the wound has deepened? In Cayce's symbolic language, the second rise of the builder coincides with a testing period, not just for the leader, but for the society that elevates him. This test is not about loyalty to a person, but clarity about values. What matters more, order or principle, strength or restraint, winning or truth? He warned that when a society places its faith in structures rather than foundations, collapse becomes a matter of timing, not possibility. Towers fall not because they are tall, but because they are rigid, because they cannot adapt when conditions shift. And according to his timeline, the return of the builder is never the end of the story. It is the moment before convergence, the point at which multiple crises, long developing, long ignored, begin to align. The archetype, then, is not the message, it is the signal. A signal that something deeper is reaching its limit.
Prophetic documentary thriller. When pressure builds unnoticed for long enough, release does not come gently. Edgar Cayce warned that the most dangerous moments were not those marked by a single disaster, but those when multiple stresses converged on the same timeline. Individually, each strain could be managed. Together, they created a cascade. Now consider what happens when economic instability, environmental disruption, and institutional conflict begin to overlap, not sequentially, but simultaneously. Cayce described this convergence as the true heart of the Great Change. He spoke first of an economic reckoning, not merely a recession or a downturn, but a structural failure, what he referred to as the collapse of false foundations. In his language, this meant systems built on speculation rather than substance, on debt rather than productivity, on confidence rather than resilience. These systems appeared stable because belief sustained them, but belief, he warned, was fragile. Does this sound familiar? According to his readings, the trigger would not be obvious at first. It would not arrive as a singular shock, but as a chain reaction. Trade relationships would strain, alliances would weaken. Markets, long accustomed to intervention and reassurance, would react violently when certainty disappeared. The most unsettling aspect of this collapse, Cayce suggested, was that it would feel self-inflicted. Policies intended to restore strength would instead expose weakness. He emphasized timing here. The mid-2020s were not arbitrary. They represented a moment when accumulated imbalances reached a breaking point, when attempts to correct course arrived too late to prevent disruption. The result was not total ruin, but disorientation, a sudden realization that the rules had changed. And this economic shock, Cayce insisted, would not occur in isolation. Alongside financial instability, he foresaw environmental consequences accelerating with alarming speed. He spoke often of water, not symbolically, but physically, flooding, rising seas, storms increasing in both frequency and intensity. In particular, he warns that coastlines long considered secure would face repeated assault. Infrastructure designed for a different climate would prove inadequate. What makes this aspect of his warning striking is the cause he identified. Cayce did not frame these events as random acts of nature. He described them as responses, reactions to prolonged neglect. Human decisions, he believed, altered natural balance, and when balance was ignored long enough, correction followed. The phrase he used, "the sea reclaiming what was built," was not poetic flourish, it was consequence, a reminder that permanence was an illusion when foundations were misjudged. Environmental stress in his framework was both physical and psychological. Disasters did not just damage land, they eroded confidence, displaced populations, and strained governance. Now consider what happens when economic strain and environmental crisis unfold together. Resources tighten, insurance systems falter, public trust erodes further. Each challenge amplifies the other. And in that amplified state, the third crisis Cayce described begins to surface, the most destabilizing of all. He warned of a constitutional rupture, a moment when the mechanisms designed to balance power would be tested beyond their limits. This was not framed as a sudden overthrow, but as a gradual escalation of conflict between institutions. Courts, legislatures, executives, each asserting authority, each questioning legitimacy. The result, Cayce said, was paralysis. In this environment, the rule of law becomes contested terrain. Every decision is interpreted through partisan lenses. Outcomes lose acceptance. The idea of neutral arbitration begins to dissolve. Cayce referred to this condition as civil strife, though he did not limit the term to violence. He used it to describe a deeper fracture, a breakdown in shared agreement about rules themselves. Does this sound familiar? He suggested that this institutional conflict would peak when leadership resisted restraint, when authority was framed as personal mandate rather than conditional trust.
The danger, he warned, was not tyranny in the dramatic sense, but normalization. Each small overreach justified by emergency, each precedent set in crisis becoming permanent. At the center of this rupture, Cayce placed what he called the judgment of the builders. This was not a religious event, it was exposure, legal scrutiny, public reckoning, a moment when actions taken under the banner of strength were measured against consequence. He described leaders facing challenges not from foreign enemies, but from the systems they claimed to command. What made this moment unprecedented, in his view, was its timing. Legal and constitutional tests would occur while authority remained in place, not after power was relinquished, but during its exercise. This overlap created tension without historical parallel. A nation forced to decide whether stability mattered more than principle, or whether principle justified instability. Cayce believed this decision point would not be resolved cleanly. There would be no unanimous outcome. Instead, the process itself would leave scars. Faith in institutions would either be restored through accountability or further eroded through perceived injustice. And all of this, he warned, converged on the same narrow window: economic shock, environmental disruption, constitutional crisis. Not spread across decades, not isolated by recovery periods, but overlapping, compounding, reinforcing one another. This convergence, Cayce suggested, marked the approach of a point of no return, not because collapse was guaranteed, but because denial was no longer possible. What if these crises are not warnings of the future, but descriptions of momentum already in motion? Cayce's framework does not ask whether a society deserves such trials. It asks whether it recognizes them, whether it understands that systems, like structures, reflect the integrity of their foundations, and whether those foundations were ever examined honestly. As the great change accelerates, Cayce implied choice narrows, not between comfort and discomfort, but between awareness and avoidance. The former demands responsibility, the latter promises temporary relief at the cost of deeper reckoning later. And according to his timeline, later is not far away.
As timelines converge, the tone of Edgar Cayce's language changes. The urgency softens, but the weight deepens. He no longer speaks primarily of events, but of thresholds, moments when momentum outweighs intention and when the future stops feeling distant and begins to press inward. Now, consider what it means to arrive at such a threshold, not with certainty, but with awareness. Cayce believed that history moved in cycles, guided not only by economics or politics, but by rhythms older than nations themselves. He often referenced astrological alignments, not as destiny, but as indicators, signals that conditions were ripe for transformation. When certain cycles closed and others opened, unresolved tensions surfaced naturally. According to his readings, the mid-2020s represented one of these convergence points, and within that convergence, 2026 stood out. He described it as a moment of compression, a point where consequences long delayed could no longer be postponed, where choices made years earlier finally revealed their full shape. In this sense, 2026 was not portrayed as a sudden collapse, but as a mirror, a year that reflected back what had been built, what had been neglected, and what had been misunderstood. Does this sound familiar? Yet Cayce did not frame this moment as punishment. He framed it as opportunity, a final test of discernment. He warned that when systems falter, fear accelerates, but he also insisted that fear was not the only possible response. In times of upheaval, people tend to search outward for leaders, for structures, for guarantees. Cayce suggested the opposite path was necessary, a turning inward,
a reassessment of values that could not be legislated or enforced. This is where his message becomes quieter. He spoke of a great awakening, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a gradual shift in perception, an awareness spreading not from institutions, but from individuals. He referred to this as a form of shared consciousness, an understanding that power without accountability was hollow, that progress without compassion was unstable, and that survival without meaning was incomplete. In this framework, 2026 is not simply a political or economic milestone, it is an ethical one, a moment when societies are asked, not commanded, to choose what they will prioritize once illusions fall away: stability or truth, control or responsibility, comfort or clarity. Now the pace slows. Imagine a future not defined by headlines, but by reflection. A moment after the noise fades, when the question is no longer who was right or wrong, but what was learned. Cayce believed that every collapse contained the seed of renewal, but only if recognized as such. Ignored, it repeated. Understood, it transformed. His final warnings were not meant to provoke panic. They were meant to invite preparation, not of resources alone, but of mindset. He believed that those living through periods of great change were not accidental participants. They were positioned there intentionally to decide how the cycle would turn next. So perhaps the question is not whether Edgar Cayce foresaw a specific outcome in 2026. Perhaps the deeper question is whether we recognize the patterns he described while there is still time to respond differently. And as the story fades, that question lingers quietly, unanswered, but impossible to ignore.